From the Hype HQ studio in Chicago, Illinois, it's Startup Hype Man, the podcast. Hello, everyone. My name is Raj Nation, and I am the founder of Startup Hype Man. Fast-growing startups work with me because they want to become better storytellers. Whether that's for customers, investors, or a packed audience, they know that story is their ticket to stand out, stand apart, and change the game. And this podcast here is where I talk with entrepreneurs and leaders in the startup ecosystem, ranging from scale stage to early stage, as they share specific strategies that they have executed to stand out across three specific areas: sales, marketing, and people. Before we begin today's episode, remember you can head to startuphypeman.com and subscribe to the newsletter that doesn't suck. You'll get new podcast episodes and timely reads written by me, but also helpful articles from around the web and a notice of upcoming pitch competitions. All right, let's dive in and hear how today's guest is changing the game. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is part 2 of my conversation with Sean Ammirati, investor, entrepreneur, and author of the international bestseller, The Science of Growth. If you missed out on part 1, well, the obvious thing to do would be to go back and listen to that first so that this half of the conversation has context. What we've been talking about to this point in part 1 of the episode was the science of massive growth-catalyzing events. Sean and his students at Carnegie Mellon University undertook a research project several years ago where they looked at what distinguishes companies when they seemingly have the same or very similar characteristics. They get to product market fit, and then one takes off, but the other doesn't. So for example, we all know LinkedIn, but many of us, myself included, have never heard of Spoke. Both companies got to product market fit. One company is still thriving today. And that's what our conversation has centered around. Now, part 1, we emphasized sort of the buildup to what gets someone to these catalyzing events, these growth catalyzing events. We talked about the 4 prerequisites for success. We defined what a catalyst is in this situation. So now let's dive deeper into some specific examples and within the specific types of catalyzing events. So we identified there are also 4 types of growth catalyzing events, and they are viral growth, drafting off platforms, double trigger events, and optimizing algorithms. So what we're going to do in this part 2 of the episode is go through each of those 4 types of growth catalyzing events and talk through examples, companies that did it well, companies who looked similar but did not do it so well and did not last or did not thrive as much. So Sean, welcome back first off. Thank you for joining me for part 2.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Let's start with viral growth. I think when people hear the idea of going viral, their idea is, we put up a video on YouTube and it got 1 million hits overnight. Now, I think that is an example of viral. I just don't think it's something that necessarily everyone can bank on, as it's not really a strategy. And I think very few accomplish. And oftentimes I think viral, it's like maybe you saw it when it got 1 million views, but it might have been a slow crawl to get there. So can you explain viral growth as you see it through your research and talk through an example or 2 of a company that achieved this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're right. I think we tend to think virality or viral growth, and obviously like these terms are more loaded in 2020 than they were in 2016 when we wrote the book, right?
Viral growth.
Viral growth. People understand the math a bit more today than they did in 2016. But as it relates to kind of viral growth as a scaling your business strategy, right? People tend to think that the internet is sort of what invented this phenomenon. And it's just not true, right? People have been referring products to people for a long, long time. What's unique is that the internet and sort of this digital communication in general has allowed us to track how effective that is as a sales channel and then optimize that work, right? So regardless of what company you're talking about, when you're doing viral growth, I think the other thing that's important to point out is exactly where you were going. This often feels like an overnight success story, but in fact, what it really is it's a grind. You're continuing to grind away. You're continuing to optimize. You're continuing to test things. And eventually you get to a point where every time someone refers a product to another customer, additional new customer to the solution, right? That's every time they refer a product to another customer and that customer signs up. So this is the referral and the sign up. Then that new customer will refer and sign up at least one additional customer. So you have more than one new customer for every new customer that you refer, or what's called a viral coefficient of greater than one, right? Mm-hmm. And that used to be really hard to figure out, because if you're talking about your grandfather talking to his buddy at the, pub on a Friday night, that's not there's no ability to actually measure that. There's no ability to optimize that. There's no ability to sort of influence the message. But what the internet's made unique is all of a sudden now this technique that's worked for a long time, we can now measure and optimize. And I think that's what's interesting. And then when you think about that, what that allows these businesses to do is to what I would call grind, or just continue to tweak all the different, both like the way you're presenting the message to them, how you're prompting them to do the referral, what the text or what the conversation around that referral is, so that each step along that way, you're increasing the effectiveness of the number of invitations sent out, the conversion rate of those invitations, or how quickly those people go from getting an invitation to converting and sending out their batch of invitations, which are sort of the three levers that have been the levers for a long time, but now all of a sudden there's transparency. You can actually look into it and see it. And when you see, especially a lot of these social platforms, a Facebook Friendster or a LinkedIn Spoke, right? What you end up seeing is that these are inherently network businesses, and therefore optimizing the virality of the communication becomes just an incredible way to catalyze and ultimately sort of optimize the growth rate of those businesses.
I think I recall hearing, and I believe it was in the Social Media Dilemma documentary that just came out on Netflix, where one of the original product heads at Facebook mentioned their goal or like their measure of success was if one person can, I think, get 7 friends in the first 10 days. I might have the numbers backwards on that, or it's very close to that. That meant that person was going to stick around on the platform and become more or less a power user. Yep. And it wasn't about individually getting as many one people on the platform, but just, can you get one person to 7 friends? And then that would expand their business greatly.
Yeah. And there's interesting counterintuitive things around that as well, right? So most people's intuition would be, if that's what you're optimizing for, then you want to go as broad as possible, as quickly as possible. But what Facebook realized is that, and what frankly Friendster did not, is that when you're going broad like that, you just dramatically increase the chance of you showing up on that platform and not knowing anybody on the platform. Right. And so one of the things that Facebook did really well, right, is they constrained who was able to use Facebook to these kind of tiers, where that increased the probability that when you showed up, people you knew showed up, right? So it started as a social network for Harvard, and then for other schools like Harvard, right? So other Ivy Leagues and Stanford. And they sort of went school by school. And they actually also did something really interesting, which is they aggressively managed the wait list of how they were going to add the next school by people who were high school friends of other colleges that were on Facebook already. They were requesting, hey, my friends are on here already. I'd like to be part of it. Again, getting to your point of, making sure that there's no nodes on the network when they sign up. There's a funny example of this for what it's worth, which is when, so Facebook tended to go kind of Harvard, Stanford, other Ivies, these other really good schools, right? And then they actually went to Penn State, which for people who aren't familiar with Penn State, it's actually a very good school in central Pennsylvania, incredible school, but it's a land grant Big Ten school. It's like the number of students at Penn State versus the number of students at, your kind of Ivy League school, it's an order of magnitude different, right? And when they flipped the switch on to turn Penn State email addresses on, everybody was convinced that they were being hacked for a couple of minutes, because they thought they knew what they were doing, right? And in many ways they did, but it's like, oh wow, turns out a land grant Big Ten school looks really different than Harvard or Stanford, right? Sure. And so, but it's the same dynamic you're talking about. And so you're optimizing for invite sent, conversion, and then And this time to send the next time for that customer to become viral themselves becomes really important as well, right? So time from when you get the invite to when you convert and then start inviting your friends, that becomes the other critical part of it. And to your point, if you can make sure that when someone shows up, they know other people, you're going to significantly increase the speed at which they're an engaged user and start inviting their own friends to the platform.
There's a couple of things I want to point out and kind of add follow-up questions to, and that is to give some timeline context here. I remember my senior year of high school, some of my friends who were also seniors in high school creating Facebook accounts. So it had dripped beyond college at that point.
So you were outside of college, but it was still
correct.
A student network.
And it had
like,
I think it was just by senior year was when it got to high school. And I remember kind of being confused by it. I didn't get an account. And I remember I created an account after going to orientation weekend or whatever it was called, like, freshman orientation, like a month before you actually move in to college. And what's funny is I remember like asking everyone in my little orientation group for their AIM screen name, calling back to what our conversation was in part one. And then everyone was like, well, why don't you have Facebook? And so then I came out of that orientation and I created a Facebook account and started connecting with these people who I had just had orientation week with, plus my high school friends. While I was in high school, I think I remember by my sophomore year, I remember hearing about something called MySpace. I think it was junior year, people playing around on something called Zanga and LiveJournal. And the reason I'm bringing these up is because all of these platforms did have a lot of users, right? And I think what you're saying is product market fit can be achieved not doing these strategies, but it's how do you go beyond product market fit and really become a company that has lasting power and dominates everyone else, right?
That's right. And some of it, so some of the companies that you're talking about there, for what it's worth, are part of the studies. Some are not. We'll get to the MySpace example in a minute when we get to drafting off platforms. But LiveJournal was part of the movable type network of properties, right? So that was a competitor to WordPress more than a competitor to Facebook, right? It's more of a publishing platform than a social communications platform. But I think what you see in both of those, right, is that choices that those companies made that were different than the choices that companies succeeded ended up resulting in one scaling up and another stalling out. And it's tempting. I think I talked about this when we started. We sort of had this as, get to product market fit and then run your business like a scaling business. But when you actually look at these case studies, you see the sort of middle step of like, okay, well, something happens between product market fit and operating it in this hyperscale mode. And it's not exactly the same thing in each of these cases, but they fit into these four buckets. So we've talked about viral growth, but there's obviously three other ones. And it's not that every company would do all four of them. In fact, nobody did all four of them, but they tend to do one or two of these. And I think what Facebook did incredibly well was the virality. The other thing Facebook did really well was their first interaction. If you go back to the prerequisites for a minute, their first interaction was so good and so tight because of some of the things we talked about. It really enabled them to have that great viral growth. And I think in all four cases, you'll see that fourth step in the prerequisites is really the springboard into these catalyzing events. And that gets to, I think, some of the stuff that you do with startups as well, where you help them think about, well, how do they talk about that? How do they talk about this from the perspective of the user, not the perspective of the entrepreneur, right? Like, Mark wasn't saying, let me tell you how cool it is to connect all the world's people to his Facebook members. He was certainly talking about that when he was talking to investors and he was talking to employees, things like that. But he was saying, hey, when you go to college orientation, let's make sure that you can, stay up to date with all the friends you make there so that when you come back in a month, you have friends and you're ready to plug into your college experience.
Well, and I was thinking about this last night before we were going to record this morning, and it occurred to me how much, and to call back to one of your prerequisites from the last episode, which is founder vision, how much it ends up actually influencing the message if the vision is clear, right? And Zuckerberg's internal vision was connect the world. Maybe at first it was it was whatever. He was just kind of messing around. Then when he realized it had something, that's when he said, okay, we can connect the world here. But if you look at how
it was much faster than people appreciate as well, for what it's worth. Like one of the things that people, when this first came out, I did a number of interviews around the book, and people said, well, I mean, remember that interview on CNBC? He had no idea what he was building. He was building, he even calls it a college social network at that point. I was like, go back and rewatch the video today, and you'll see that like he absolutely is talking about a much bigger vision. Now he's broken that vision down into these steps because he understands you got to have a great first interaction. You got to make sure that you actually know people when you show up on these social sites, right? It's not a 0 to 1 where you just is there from the beginning. I think this is the magic of entrepreneurship, right? It's massive vision followed by lots of iterative experiments to refine that massive vision
with like practicality at like the front end of it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I teach the lean entrepreneurship class at Carnegie Mellon, and people will often say to me like, well, I don't like lean entrepreneurship. Like I want big, ambitious vision. It's like, no. The lean startup methodology does not replace vision with experiments. It says take your vision and then run experiments around that vision. That's, I think, why we call it pivoting, not traveling, right? One foot is planted in your vision and the other foot is iterating around based on what you hear from the market.
Yeah. And, furthering on that note, as I was thinking about this last night, I think if you really think about the initial success of Facebook and getting to that product market fit, it could have been so easy for them to be like, we could be another Shutterfly and our product could be selling photo books off of all these photos you've uploaded. But the vision was not a photo sharing platform. Photo sharing was a function of the vision of connection. And I recall, I don't know if it's still the case, but I recall at least maybe back in 2007, 2008, because I did write a paper in my freshman year of college that touched on Facebook a little bit for a different purpose. And I remember I had cited the exact copy of the homepage, the login page at that point. And the messaging on it was something like, Facebook is a place to like hang out with and connect with your friends. It wasn't saying Facebook is where you can upload photos and post updates on your life, Yep.
But I think this gets to your grinding point as well. So later in the book, not in the precursor, we'll talk about being data informed, not data driven. And that's actually a quote I got from Adam Mosseri when he was just a product manager on the Facebook Photos team. And what Facebook realized was exactly what you're saying. Like the value of the service was connecting with your friends. But what they also knew back then was photos became the atomic unit that helped people connect. And today I would argue that's videos. But back at that point, it was photos. And early in Facebook's history, they only had one photo on the site. It was your profile photo. And what they would see is people would come multiple times a day and change their profile picture. And then they're like, okay, well, let's get people to allow them to upload massive amounts of photos. This atomic unit of connecting. And what they realized was the more photos they could get you to upload, not only the more engaged you would be with the platform, but also the more engaged your friends would be with the platform, right? So it's both of those things. And when Facebook realized that, then the question became, okay, how do we dramatically drive up the number of photos people are uploading, right? And now we get back to this grinding process again. And so they optimize and optimize and optimize. And then they realize, wait a minute, a certain percentage of our users don't realize they can upload more than one file at a time. So they did something counterintuitive, right? They added a screen which told them, hey, if you hold down the shift key, you can upload more than one photo, right? You see this dramatic spike in the number of photos uploaded, right? To me, this is this blend of being data informed, not data driven. But photos, to your point, like they're this atomic unit of these social services that become really important. It's why when Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion, people thought that was crazy at the time. But I suspect this history of knowing how important photos were is part of what informs someone like Mark saying, you know what, $1 billion is actually a steal for a business like this.
Yeah, I also think, total hypothesis here, they saw the Facebook platform was getting more complex, and they saw this how there's still attractiveness and simplicity, which Instagram had at the time. And it's gotten a little bit more complex now, but it's still largely much simpler to use? Because there's less going on.
It was mobile first, right?
Yeah.
Which at the time Facebook was not. And this is a different conversation. But the quick other punchline here, right, is remember you're talking about 1% of the company.
Yeah,
So it's a relatively smart head at that kind of calculation as well.
Let's talk about the next part, which is drafting off platforms. And I think this is my favorite, but what is drafting off platforms and who can we point to as a use case?
Lots of good examples here, but probably a fun one that people remember, and I think it illustrates the point well, would be the YouTube Rever example, right? So I am sure you syndicate parts of this content to YouTube. I'm pretty sure you don't do a lot on Rever these days. But when you think about YouTube, right, one of the things that the team at YouTube were masters at was, okay, where do people have this problem of wanting to put videos on their site but don't know how to do it? And one of the really popular examples would be putting it on your MySpace page. So, you'd mentioned MySpace page earlier. Like we could certainly have done Facebook MySpace instead of Facebook Friendster. Like in effect, it was really kind of all three of those competing for this communication channel. The MySpace example gets a little tricky because it sort of spans this broadcast and communication platform, right? So it's sort of a little bit of WordPress and a little bit of Facebook. But anyways, YouTube, one of the things they did really well was they made it super easy to embed YouTube videos on MySpace pages, even for people who didn't know how to program. Most people who had MySpace pages, that's how they learned HTML. And only a subset of the MySpace users knew how to do it. And so the easier you could teach them how to embed the HTML on the page, the better. And YouTube made it really easy to do that. And they also made it really easy for other people who came to a MySpace page, saw a video, to realize, oh, I can grab this and put it on my MySpace page as well, right? Mm-hmm. So the question you want to ask yourself when you're talking about drafting off platforms is, where is there a large community of engaged users who have the problem my product solves, but don't yet know how to solve it? Or maybe they're solving it today kind of by hacking a solution together, right? And that's the sort of, and if you can find those communities, then you're golden. So YouTube on top of MySpace, PayPal on top of eBay, right? You've got lots of people doing transactions on eBay, and then they're trying to figure out how to send money back and forth. Yeah. Well, PayPal comes in and says, hey, we can solve that problem for you.
Which I remember, sorry to cut you off there. I remember being an early user of eBay. And I think my first purchase, I remember getting a cashier's check and sending it in the mail. And I was very young at the time, but I do remember that being a thing. And then it's funny because I initially remember when the PayPal thing came about and it was kind of like featured as like, hey, you can do this. I do remember, because I was still young and I needed like parents' permission to create accounts and stuff. I remember my mom saying, no, don't put your credit card on the internet. It's not safe.
Sure. When they had to do a lot of things to get people comfortable with that, right? I mean, PayPal, the eBay, PayPal was part of it. PayPal also did some really interesting things around paying people to sign up for the service around viral growth as well. But when you think about YouTube on top of MySpace or PayPal on top of eBay, what you're seeing is massive engaged users have a problem. YouTube and PayPal step in and solve it. Now, the thing you want to be, there is an important caution on the drafting off platforms as well, which is you want to make sure that that's not the only place people get value from your product, right? Because so both MySpace would end up trying to launch their own video player, and eBay would launch their own payments product before ultimately eBay would buy PayPal. Yeah. And YouTube would frankly ultimately eclipse MySpace and outkick the coverage there, right? And in both those cases, what you see is that's because the service was valuable not only on those platforms they're drafting off of, but also on all these other platforms. The example of the Twitter API, I think, is a great example of where a lot of people did not, and a few did kind of follow this heuristic, right? So lots of interesting people built things on top of the Twitter platform, but only a small percentage of them figured out how to add value outside of the Twitter ecosystem as well. And ultimately that becomes a choke point. Like if all you're doing is adding value there, then the strategy won't work. But if you can use that community who has this problem as a way to catalyze your growth, but then make sure you have product market fit outside of it as well, then you can end up in this really interesting situation, right? Where all of a sudden you're grabbing users from that platform that you're drafting off of, but still continuing to scale up as an independent company as well.
In the YouTube example, you mentioned the other company that didn't make it far was Rever. And I, aside from our conversations and reading the book, I have not ever heard of Rever. What I did learn in the book was this whole idea that Rever tried the MySpace play as well. Like they couldn't come to an agreement with MySpace's terms of service in that Rever was they wanted to put pre-roll and mid-roll ads into those videos that could be embedded on MySpace.
So Rever was really worried about lots of things at the same time, all of which made it really hard to focus on the most important things. And this gets more to the sustainable long-term growth. But what's interesting is in the early phases, right, you've got this vision and you're doing lots and lots of experiments. At a certain point, when things start to work, you need to get more to like, here's our North Star metric, here's what we're running after, and we'll figure the other stuff out later. Rever kind of got to a similar point as YouTube, and rather than focusing on scaling and a certain subset of North Star metrics, kept doing lots of different things at the same time and sort of thrashing. So instead of saying, okay, let's just figure out how to make our videos ubiquitous on the internet, get the plugins working everywhere. There's like, okay, let's figure out our monetization model. Let's go sign kind of in a very business development 1.0 way. Let's go sign a bunch of contracts with a bunch of different third parties and you sort of add friction to the process there, right? And so I think it was smart team did lots of things right, but I think ultimately we're trying to do too many things, whereas YouTube looks a lot more like a Facebook or a Mint or a frankly, almost any of these, which is they're sort of focused on these critical North Star metrics when they enter that point and don't get distracted by a lot of these other things. And that distraction ultimately, in the case of drafting off of the MySpace platform, killed Rever because they lost that whole distribution opportunity that allowed YouTube to really end up becoming ubiquitous there.
Yeah, and I think there's a lesson here for a lot of the people who are building these kind of user-based companies where monetization traditionally comes later. And the lesson is monetization traditionally comes later. It's really hard to have success if you're trying to both make money off of, say, advertising while also trying to grow the user base, because it just creates a high friction product. Like what you need to do is, as I see it, get people on the platform, get them actively using it, get them coming back to it. And then you bring in that ad network after you have all that, because now the people are entrenched in the product.
So I think that's absolutely true for businesses where the revenue model is obvious and it's something like advertising or, you know, a freemium model where there's an obvious premium feature to it. You know, Duolingo is a Pittsburgh startup that's, you know, started by a colleague at Carnegie Mellon, right? So I've sort of had a chance to watch, right? It was obvious, like, I mean, Duolingo raised, and this is public information, at a $500 million valuation as effectively a pre-revenue company. And the reason they did that was their user growth was so amazing. And it was so obvious that, like, well, when they want to turn monetization on, it'll be very evident how you do the monetization. Not easy, but it'll be evident. And the right team, laser focused on monetization at the right point, will be able to figure it out. And certainly today, it's a great business, not just a great social tool, right? But I think that advice, there's two things that are important for entrepreneurs to keep in mind. One, I think many entrepreneurs underappreciate how fast your user base needs to be growing and how engaged your user base needs to be for that to be wise advice. Like, that's point one. I see a lot of people with sort of very mediocre growth that are like, man, I went from 100 users to 200 users to 300 users over the last 3 months. Like, I'm not going to focus on monetizing. I've just got this amazing growth. It's like, that's not amazing growth. Yeah,
it's got to be like 100 to 1,000 to 10,000.
Right, exactly, right? It's got to be this sort of exponential growth rate, right? And you've got to have a business where it's obvious that you can monetize it that way. You know, a SaaS tool, an enterprise SaaS tool, I would not recommend running that playbook. It's just, it doesn't fit. So I think that advice is situationally correct and was definitely right for YouTube, was definitely correct for Facebook, was definitely correct for Instagram for what it's worth, and was correct for Duolingo as a more recent example, but is not necessarily correct for all the people listening to this.
Yeah. Our third growth catalyzing event is what you call double trigger events. Talk us through this.
Yeah. So this one is interesting because out of all the catalyzing events, this is the one that I think makes people most confused about this concept of launching, right? So most people will talk about these double trigger events as company X launched at event Y, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, oh, Twitter launched at South by Southwest. Airbnb launched at the DNC convention, right? And yet what you realize when you actually go look at these cases is, in fact, those companies had been around for months and months before those events. Those events are what blew up the service, right? So, I mean, I was at South by the year Twitter launched there, and it was absolutely contagious there. But it wasn't like it was new. I actually had signed up for Twitter before going to South by Southwest, right? So it wasn't like I found out about it there. It's just that all of a sudden I sort of discovered the utility of Twitter when I was at the conference. And that was true for a lot of users because the problem people had at South by Southwest, Twitter solved in a really elegant way. And they were able to expose that to that community. And then just as importantly, that community went home and kept using it. Right? If everybody had enjoyed it at South by and then never used it again, that wouldn't be a double trigger event. And so it's these things that kind of these sort of events that come along and blow it up. And I talk about this in the book, but we actually have used this with some of our portfolio companies because, you can think about, okay, where is there, the answer is not good startup, ABC. You should also go to South by Southwest and launch there. In fact, I would argue for most companies, launching at South by Southwest is a terrible idea today. Right? And there's two reasons. One, you don't have the problem. Your startup probably doesn't solve the problems that people have at South by Southwest. And even if you do, like remember 2 years ago, the electric scooter, right? The marketing budget that you're going to need to spend to cut through the noise when literally the next marketer there is also buying Super Bowl ads. It's not the sort of niche conference that it was in, 2007 when Twitter.
Yeah. Now it's like, it's a phenomenon.
It's a phenomenon. Like, and it's still fun.
Thing, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've been going since, before the Twitter event, and it used to be one kind of thing, and it's a different thing now. They're both fun, but they're very different. And frankly, the only thing that's the same is they're called South by Southwest, and they're both in Austin, and there's still a music and a film festival that goes on around the event. But I mean, the year Twitter launched at South by Southwest, for perspective, it was one hall of the convention center. That was the entirety of the conference, of the interactive part of it, right? And the real question was during the day, if you were in a panel that was terrible, what other panel could you go to, right? And so you get on Twitter and be like, oh, this panel's bad. I'm going to go down the hall and see Matt Mullenweg talking about WordPress, right? Oh, that's not very good. Okay, I'll go see Eb talking here, right? And then at night, it was who's giving free beer out. And it turned out Twitter was really good at answering both of those questions. And the next year, Foursquare, again, good success there. Although I'd argue not as catalyzing as Twitter. And then after that, it's basically been dominated by the big companies. But the question that startups can ask themselves is, okay, for my product or service, what's similar to the DNC convention or to South by Southwest for my service, right? So we had a company that we ultimately sold to Yelp called No Wait, which solved this problem for helping people find restaurant wait times for casual dining restaurants. And it turns out the Masters in Augusta, Georgia is the busiest restaurants in America are in Augusta during the Masters golf tournament. And so we basically took over Augusta, Georgia. We had 50 restaurants using our No Wait platform. And it was exactly what I call it was a catalyzing event for the business. And so that's how you think about it. So for your startup, the question to ask yourself is, okay, what event or what thing going on do people have the problem my startup solves? Can I come in and use this to dramatically increase the awareness about my product? It's probably not South by Southwest. It's probably not a political convention at this point, but there likely is an event where you can think about this, or at least for some subset of startups, this will be a good growth strategy for them.
A couple more comments and questions on this before we move into our fourth and final event type. First question to you is, when we say double trigger events, do we literally mean it has to be an event, or could the definition of event be stretched out to something beyond just like a conference, whether physical or virtual?
Yeah, absolutely. It extends beyond that. The thing is, those events are the easiest ones to engineer. The other types of double trigger events often are a little more opportunistic. So for example, someone uploading the SNL skit Lazy Sunday to YouTube, right? Mm-hmm. YouTube couldn't engineer that, but when that happened, it was absolutely a double trigger event. Or in the case of the WordPress movable type, the movable type changing their open source licensing model, and Matt Mullenweg at WordPress just stepping in and using that to catalyze this growth. Here's the critical thing about the other two types, though. Communication competencies become incredibly important for all three of those, but especially the second and third. And honestly, if I could rewrite the book, like if I could go back and do like Science of Growth 2.0, this is something I would talk a lot more about, right? Because I think I touch on it in the context of like, well, PR is changing. It's important to have your message tight. But I think how you end up like WordPress or like YouTube in that situation is that you have your foundational elevator pitch extremely tight, and you know how to react and play offense when those other types of double trigger events happen. And I think it's true across the board, but especially for type 2 and type 3 of double trigger events. And I think most entrepreneurs today think about their elevator pitch, frankly, as like, well, this is something I need to get right so that I can raise investment dollars. Where in fact, what it really is this is the core building block upon which I can build all the different communications that are going to be important for my business. And you see those different types of communications flowing through these different types of catalyzing events.
My heart flutters when I hear you talk about the importance of an elevator pitch and how it influences all the other types of communication, because it's what I've been preaching for a few years now to all the companies that I work with and all the workshops that I teach on the topic. One other thing I want to highlight within the Twitter example and the double trigger event of the quote unquote launch at South by Southwest is coming back to what you just said about the communication being strong combined with founder vision. Is people interacted there, but they didn't leave saying Twitter is an event communication tool. It was Twitter is what I can go to be piped into what's happening in the world, to add my voice to the conversation, right? And I think not only usability, but then founder vision to not say, oh, we had a lot of success here. You know what we are? An event app.
Well, in fact, it's a great point. And actually, a lot of users did say, oh, Twitter's really useful at events, but I don't think it'll be useful anywhere else. But I think it was that founder vision that was like, no. And remember, Ev had created Blogger. So before he created Twitter, he created Blogger, right? Which kind of created this infrastructure of knowing how people updated. And one of the things they found in Blogger is the more text boxes there were on the screen, the fewer times people posted, right? So if you just had title and blog post, you get in a certain number of posts. If you had title, tags, blog post, the text, you'd have fewer posts, right? And so in many ways, Twitter was sort of the ultimate simplification of that. So I think they did an incredible job saying, no, this is bigger than just an event conversation platform. This is really what we're doing in the world conversation, right? And if you look at the early tweets, it took the community some time to sort of figure that out and navigate through that. But once they figured that out, right, it ended up becoming this really interesting platform. And I think what was great is people came back from South by thinking, okay, that was fun for South by Southwest. But if you've gone to a conference like that, especially what South by used to be versus what it is today, when you come home, there's a little bit of this like, oh, I was, kind of post mountaintop experience, right? It's like, oh, that was so fun hanging out for 3 or 4 days with people who really got the internet as well. And I think people saw it happening. It's like, oh, I can keep this conversation going on that Twitter platform that I was using. And then the rest is history, as they say. So,
yeah. And I don't think they could have predicted, but it would ultimately become the primary mode of communication for the president of the United States, right? And I don't think they could have predicted that, but if they were just an event app, or if they saw themselves as an event app, it would not have gotten to that point.
That's right.
Let's take a few minutes now to touch on the final type of growth catalyst, which is optimizing algorithm. The word of the day every day in startup land is the algorithm.
Sure.
So what do we mean here? And I'm curious how you feel this has changed in terms of like what the algorithms to follow are and what platforms to be looking at.
Yeah. And similar thing, and like if I could rewrite or if I could do a 2.0, like I would actually say optimizing new algorithms. Like, and I think frankly, just the examples at the time we did it, there just weren't enough. There wasn't enough kind of tape to really think about this as well as you can think about it 4 years later. Because as you say, algorithms run a much, much larger part of our life today than they did when I wrote this book, right? But when you think about optimizing algorithms, what I'm specifically saying is when new algorithms emerge that make recommendations for people on products and services, before that algorithm becomes efficient, where it's doing a great job making the smartest recommendation across a large swath of different options, there's often an opportunity to arbitrage that algorithm at the beginning. So go back, 20 years, you could build some really interesting businesses arbitraging the Google search engine algorithm. Go back to when the iPhone and the App Store came out, you could do some really interesting arbitrage opportunities around the iTunes store. More recently, you've seen different social platforms where people have built interesting content businesses by optimizing the recommendations coming out of the Facebook news feed or the Instagram algorithm, right? But by the time those algorithms become really efficient, it's hard for a startup to win because there's lots and lots of people playing on that. But what you see is for some startups where an algorithm emerges that matches well to their product and their vision, or really all three of those first prerequisites, right? When it matches well there, if you can get onto that platform and optimize that algorithm before anybody else does, you can have just incredible growth, right? So Mint did this. Mint is probably the poster child of this for what it's worth. It turns out financials buying keywords for things like budgeting app are crazy expensive. But Mint figured out how to optimize the Google algorithm and then later how to optimize the iTunes App Store algorithm in a way where they just were able to pick up users so efficiently and so cost effectively because they were there before anybody else was, before other startups like Wasabi and before large companies like Intuit who would ultimately buy them, right? So I think that's the game. And so I think today in 2020, the question becomes, okay, what are the new emerging algorithms? And are there opportunities for me to optimize around that? The other point I would say is over the last year, more and more people have moved consumer decision journeys from offline to online. So there's also opportunities for things like optimizing the Yelp algorithm, optimizing the Uber Eats algorithm, right? Like there are other platforms where you can take decisions that have historically been done offline. They're now happening online, and there's algorithms driving those recommendations that can make lots of different businesses more valuable by optimizing those. And to me, that's the real art of this fourth catalyzing event. Find the new algorithm and then figure out how to optimize it.
So is the idea here then, you're not necessarily saying build your own algorithm. What you're saying is, in a way, it's actually instead of drafting off another's platform, you're drafting off another's algorithm.
100%. I mean, you could probably frame all of these as drafting off blank, right?
Maybe that's why it's my favorite.
It's like drafting off of a platform, drafting off of your existing user base, that would be viral growth, right? Drafting off of an algorithm and then drafting off of just sort of a large platform of users, right? But in each of these cases, there's sort of this draft that you can pull into. But yeah, I think people underappreciate how important algorithms are. And then, I teach at Carnegie Mellon, right? So the people who create a lot of those algorithms come through our class. It's very complicated. I get that. I am not recommending to everybody write their own algorithm, although for certain businesses that may make sense. More what I'm arguing is you need to understand what's happening there and figure out if there are these new emerging algorithms where you can get there before anybody else. And the challenge here is you may be wrong, but the cost versus the benefit is asymmetric, right? So like you might think, oh, this social platform is really important. I'm going to spend 3 months trying to optimize there. And then that platform may not take off. And it's like, okay, that was,
yeah.
But the upside is massive, right? If you end up doing that on the next search optimization opportunity or the next app store optimization opportunity, I mean, it can be the difference between changing the world and a modest success. So it's incredibly important to keep your eyes out for those algorithms and then go optimize when they enter your space. Every restaurant I talk to, I'm saying, look, you should be understanding how Yelp works, how Google Maps works, how Uber Eats works, how Instacart works. Like you need to be figuring out these emerging algorithms that are going to change how people do offline transactions in the next couple of years.
Do you have like advice then for like, you should be figuring out how these algorithms work? Like, how does someone, I mean, aside from like posting their restaurant in that case on those things, how do they then go about quote unquote studying it?
Yeah. So it's actually, when they first come out, it's actually typically much easier to decompose them than as the algorithms get sophisticated, right? Think back like the early days of Google, it was pretty easy to figure it out, right? And that's why you had white hat and black hat optimization and people were able to figure a lot of things out. Today, that algorithm is really complicated, it's really efficient, and there's a bunch of factors that go into it. And so, you see people now moving back to more the sort of 101, like just write good content, make it readable, make your page load fast, right? Sort of more usability stuff. You think about the Yelp algorithm. I mean, there's actually some interesting academic papers from a professor in Texas on this, where they've looked at how a 1-star increase in your average Yelp ratings for a local restaurant will drive, significantly more sales. So the difference between 3-star and 4-star, and probably not surprisingly, this is extremely impactful in local businesses more than national brands, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the sort of nature of where that discovery is happening.
I've got a couple more questions here before we begin our wrap up. One of them is, if you look at an example with any of these types of events, right? If you take, say, Airbnb and the Democratic National Convention and being able to create a lot of extra housing, for lack of a better word, for the people attending that. If you look at, for example, optimizing like the right algorithm at the right time. I mean, how much do you feel luck plays into this? Because it's not like Airbnb could have predicted that it would move from indoors to inside of the Broncos stadium.
That's right. So Airbnb couldn't have predicted that, but Airbnb could be prepared for that opportunity and ready to react when it happened, right? And to me, that's where the middle part of this book is different than the first and the third parts, right? In the middle part, this is more like, okay, keep your eyes open for these type of opportunities so that you can strike when they come across. And again, this is where, I think it's relevant on this podcast, especially because of the work you do. This is where understanding kind of the foundational elements of your communication strategy becomes so important, because that's part of being able to react appropriately when these things happen as well.
I also want to ask you about how do you feel these 4 types of catalyst types, the viral growth, the drafting off platforms, double trigger events, and optimizing algorithms, how much do you feel that these are viable in a B2C environment versus a B2B environment?
So I do think they work in B2B environments as well. So we haven't talked about it much in this, but we did study Cvent versus Starsight, which is a famous kind of SaaS, B2B SaaS business in the event management space. I also think, although it was not one of the companies we studied, you just can't miss what HubSpot did with advertising agencies, which in many ways was treating a bunch of these traditional ad agencies as almost their own group of people that they could catalyze their growth off of, right? It's kind of a platform, if you will, that was a bunch of users. So I think it does work in, a variety of different settings like that, right? It does work in variety of different contexts like that in B2B and B2C. I think that the first and the third, it's just like, this is how you run these kinds of businesses. But I think you need to contextualize it for your startup when you're talking about these catalyzing events specifically, though.
Yeah, and even as you say that, what came to mind for me, popular example from a couple of years ago is Drift. I don't remember at what conference, but they had one of the keynotes, which, you probably got to put up some coin to be a lead sponsor for that, but they realized it was the perfect audience to be in front of. And then they had the perfect communication where they had, this presentation that people still talk about today, right, about how they gave their vision and back to vision for what the future of marketing would be. And they called it conversational marketing. Now, functionally, what is it? It's a chatbot, but people were buzzing coming out of this about how we need to be doing conversational marketing. And the ripple effect from that has been crazy ever since then.
100%. Right. And this comes back to getting the message right so that you can be opportunistic when one of these catalyzing events becomes an opportunity for your startup.
One last question here before we hit our wrap up, and that is most of, I think with the exception of maybe one or two companies that you and your team studied for your book, were companies founded by white males. And yep. I know that's something that I'm going to guess at the time you were not intentionally being like, oh, let's only study these types of companies. As we know, that type of unconscious bias can seep in, and not just in hiring, but also all the way down to research. So I guess my first question is, were you aware of it at the time? I'll guess the answer is no. But
the answer is no there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then looking back now, how might you change that? You've talked about a couple of times if you could do a 2.0 of this book. How might that change if you had a do-over?
Yeah, we would definitely be more intentional about diversity and inclusion. And I think part of it is like the way we picked these companies bluntly was, I just said to the students, which example is interesting to you? And one of the things that I've focused on a lot over the last year is making sure that every student in my class can see him or herself in the examples that we're doing. So I'm much more intentional now about, do I have a person of color as one of my guest speakers in a class? Do I have, roughly 50-50 balance between male and female guest speakers? When I'm picking students for programs like we do a fellowship in the lab I run at Carnegie Mellon, making sure there's no unconscious bias in terms of who I'm selecting, making sure that my academic program manager who runs the lab kind of day to day for me, that she's involved in every interview as well. So there's different perspectives involved in it. So I think it 100% was just an unconscious, but certainly was an oversight for sure. And it's something that we're Carnegie Mellon, like every school, is trying to think about it. And myself personally are spending a lot of time reflecting on this as it relates to the influence that I have. We also have a conference we're running in November of this year at the lab that I run. And we're just being very intentional about, okay, let's not miss this. Let's go through and make sure that we have the right representative group of speakers along all dimensions for the types of people we're highlighting, the stories we're highlighting, the case studies we're highlighting. And, there's no real excuse, but it was just a different time for sure.
Mm-hmm. Where can our listeners find you, find the book, and learn more?
So you can find the book kind of wherever you find books. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, local bookstores, all of that. It's also in Audible, which I know for a lot of people is a easier way to consume this kind of content. So that's been fun to see it continue to do well on that platform as well. In terms of myself, just my name, SeanAmmirati.com, is kind of an aggregate of all the different things that I'm up to. It links to the lab I run at Carnegie Mellon. It links to future things I'm working on. And I'm also fairly active on Twitter and always happy to connect with people on LinkedIn as well.
To wrap up, let's do our final one or two lessons or takeaways for the listeners based on our discussions from both part one and part two. I'll go first, and then I'll toss it to you. We talked about a lot. I think if I were to almost have like my insight out of all of this, I would say, and I think I've mentioned this in a previous episode, and it bears repeating here because of all that we've discussed, and it is that when you look at what happened to make a company thrive and scale up instead of stall out, as you phrase it, ultimately, I think what we have to recognize is that the baseline is failure for most companies. And I'm sure everyone's heard that stat, 9 out of 10 companies fail. So you have to constantly be looking at what would the average person do in this situation? And how do I make sure I'm doing something better or more or differently than what the average person would do? Because these different events that you mentioned, I don't think the average person is even conscious of those types of events as they're happening. So they're not even thinking to keep an eye out for those. So that's my big takeaway is like, understand how might the average person be thinking about this and then do more than that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. There's a great quote in Horowitz's first book, I think, Hard Thing About Hard Things, where he talks about how VCs focus on statistics and entrepreneurs focus on calculus, right? In statistics, you're asking yourself like, well, what's the probability of succeeding, right? And as an investor, I need to think about this. Well, only some percentage of the investments I make are going to be successful. How do I make sure dollars flow into the most successful of those? As an entrepreneur, you're kind of like, forget about the averages. I'm going to be that one, right? And I think this catalyzing events, what my hope for that section of the book is that they become almost this radar that you can constantly have in the back of your mind as you're looking out into the landscape and saying, okay, as I look out here, is there an opportunity to catalyze this growth, especially once you've gone through those first 4 prerequisites? You don't want to catalyze your growth when you're not ready to do it either, right? Like making a bunch of people aware of a solution that's just terrible is not that's not helpful either. But once you're through the first 4 prerequisites, right, use it as this kind of constant radar where you're like, oh, there's that event. I could go do a double trigger there, or oh, there's that platform. Let me draft off of that, or oh man, let me grind away at the virality to try to optimize my growth in that way.
My final question for you, which is how we end every episode, fill in the blank, Sean. Entrepreneurship is blank.
So to me, and I use this definition in the book, and I use it almost every day, just in workshops and things that I do. Entrepreneurs create the world the way the world ought to be. And that sounds flowery to people, but think about it. From the Tesla in your garage to the Peloton in your den to the iPhone in your pocket, there's an entrepreneur behind each of those who made the world. And I think to your diversity and inclusion question earlier, one of the things I've become really passionate about over the last couple of years, as I've kind of reflected on this for myself, is let's make sure that the people who are doing that are representative of kind of society at large, right? Like gender, personal preference, like race, all those things, but also age for what it's worth. Like we can't relegate entrepreneurship to 23-year-olds either, because they end up building startups that basically are things my mom used to do for me, or my dad used to do for me, right? Like we need to make sure that like 55-year-old middle managers at a Fortune 500 company think about themselves as entrepreneurs, right? And that's why we've created the corporate startup lab. Like so we need to make sure everyone thinks about themselves as entrepreneurship and make entrepreneurship more equally distributed, because like it or not, and it feels flowery, but I think it's hard to dispute. Entrepreneurs make the world the way the world ought to be.
Entrepreneurs make the world the way they ought to be. He is Sean Ammirati, investor, entrepreneur, and author. His book, once again, is The Science of Growth. So everyone's aware, we talked about one section of the book today, so I still highly recommend you go out and grab a copy, whether it is physical, digital, or Audible, or the Audible version. Sean, thank you so much for joining, not once, but twice here on Startup Hype Man, the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
That wraps up today's conversation. Did you like what you heard? Startup Hype Man, the podcast, is available on every major platform, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and more. So be sure to subscribe on your platform of choice and leave a rating and review. Do you want to be an upcoming guest on the show? Email media@startuphypeman.com with your idea, and my team will review. Our theme song is Change the Game by Jay-Z, all rights owned by Rockefeller and Def Jam Records. And hey, if you want to work together on making your startup story the only one that matters, email me at rajiv@startuphypeman.com. That's RAJIV@startuphypeman.com. Well, that'll do it for today. Thank you for listening. Thank you to today's guests for joining. You have been checking out Startup Hype Man, the podcast. I'll catch you next week. But in the meantime, word up, raise up.